Thanks, Susan, and hello everybody, and thanks for inviting me to come and speak. It's been quite a useful experience for me to sort of think about my thoughts, if that makes sense. So in the process of pulling this presentation together. Okay, so the process is now, if I shared my screen, can you all see yourself on my shared screen? Or can you just see the slide?
Just see you in the slide.
Just see me in the slides, great, okay. So so the process for the talk today was, what does impact mean as we move away from bibliometrics, and sort of how can libraries help? What's the library involvement in this sort of agenda? So I'm going to talk a bit about what we're doing at Griffith, but also talk about that bigger question about the library involvement more generally in the impact discussion. So the question, first of all, is why impact, I think, and because I've just moved from overseas and we've also just got some material that's come from stuff that we left behind. I've been going through a lot of material at home and found this book, the publication that came out in November 2005, which was looking at the impact agenda back then. And one of the things I thought was very relevant from here is they say that Australia's not well served if the only or main audience of research is academics, and if the measures of research is worth the funding purposes are focused mainly on peer-reviewed publications and citations. So what they're saying there is that we shouldn't be doing research for research's sake. There should be another reason for it. So when we look at how people write about research in articles, as in publications, they might not think about it in this way, but certainly when you write about them in news articles, what you think about is the 4 the 5 W's and the H, which is who, what, why, when, where, how. And that is what is written in articles for publications and what's written in news articles as well, usually in slightly different configuration, but nonetheless. What the impact thing is the who cares statement. So I used to teach PhD students how to write about their work in understandable ways, and we talk about the who, what, why, where, how, and they would write that down, and then I say, what I want you to think about is why anybody cares that you're doing research into this particular type of white clover, for example. And it might be because cows that are fed a diet of that white clover have much more protein in their milk, for example, and that's why we care about it. It's not white clover, it's the milk and the protein in the milk. So it's the who cares statement. And that's what the impact is the who cares statement. The thing to think about is impact happens outside the academy. I just need to double check. Yep, so what is impact? So there's a couple of definitions here. So one is from the Australian Engagement Impact Assessment document. It's talking about impact being the contribution research makes to the economy, society, environment, or culture beyond the contribution to academic research. And in the REF, the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, they define impact as an effect on, change, or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy, or services, health, the environment, or quality of life beyond academia. So what we're talking about is impact happening outside the academy. Now I've got this picture because certainly when you're in Cambridge, the place is full of fences. It's full of places that are telling you where you're not allowed to go. And that's the academy. And the academy is very obvious at Cambridge. So then the question is, what are we measuring? So, and that's where it starts getting tricky. Because there was a white paper that came out by Sage from a sort of one-day sort of seminar thing where they got a whole lot of people together to talk about this issue. They were saying there's very little agreement about how we measure this. And while there's a requirement by governments, certainly the REF is now in the second round of doing an impact assessment, and in the REF 25% of the block grant funds that go to our institutions in the UK is being determined on the basis of their impact case studies. That's a big difference to here, where engagement impact was just a sort of add-on to ERA, and ERA itself doesn't even have any money associated with it. It's actually the Herdic return that provides the money. So the stakes are different in the UK and here in terms of the impact agenda. So there's a lot of money associated with it in the UK. But what they're doing is they're asking universities and researchers to talk about the impact of their work, but there's no commonly agreed on set of best practices or definitions. So we're all kind of casting around a bit in the dark. So back in November 2005, in that book that I uncovered, there are some sort of lists about what they're measuring. This is an example as a figure from CSIRO, selected achievements. And you can look down the bottom of that, and they're talking about things like policy advice, or new technology, or lower costs, or reduced risk. So there's a list of potential things that you could say, these are impacts, these are things that we could measure. The refs had a go at sort of listing things that you could count as impact. So they've got different areas of impact. So one's health, wellbeing and animal welfare, another one's social welfare, another's commerce and the economy. There's a whole heap of them. And then they break those down into types of impact under that kind of classification. And then what might be an indicator that that impact has occurred. Because it's one thing to say something's happened, it's another thing to kind of evidence that it's happened. And that's where things get quite tricky. So there's another way of looking at it, and one is to look at the social impact of something. So this is a repository put together by the University of Barcelona called the Social Impact Open Repository. And it's quite interesting. It's got this kind of rubric in there which looks at, it gives a sort of mark to any impact that's sort of put into the repository. It makes the point that even if your mark is 1 out of 10, it's still great because the fact that it's there means that it's had some sort of social impact. And a lot of their those sort of gradations or marks are pushed against whether or not they meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So that's an interesting kind of metric in itself. So we could say, all right, the way we're going to measure our impact is against the Sustainable Development Goals. So if they don't meet or don't reach any of those goals, then it doesn't have impact. That could be one way we could put it. So what I'm trying to point out is that there is no kind of magic rubric. Everyone's still trying to work it out. Here's another kind of metric that's turned up, which is the Humane Metrics Initiative. And so their sort of classifications are things like collegiality, quality, equity, openness, community. So this is in the way research is done. It doesn't necessarily mean impact, but I'm just trying to point out that this sort of space about measuring research in ways other than the traditional ways we measure them is still very, very nascent. We're still working around it. So I attended a talk from Madeleine Atkins, who was one of the kind of assessors of the 2014 REF impact case studies. And she came to Cambridge University to do a sort of talk on what to do next time around, because the next REF is 2021, which means everything has to be in by the end of next year, December 2020. So everyone's sort of ramping up the whole impact discussion over in the UK. And one of the things she pointed out that Cambridge made a big mistake with was it was very, very heavily reliant on saying, but we published this in Nature, so therefore it has to have had impact. And what her number one do's and don'ts was don't focus on the excellence of the underpinning research. The fact that it's published in Nature is neither here nor there in the issue of impact. And that's quite a difficult thing, particularly for an organisation like Cambridge, which is very much banks on that sort of thing, to get your head around. We need to be looking at other things, other much more difficult to measure aspects of our work. So there's lots of case studies around if you're interested. Most universities, I've just put University of Queensland and Griffith here as 2 examples, will have case studies up on their website because, of course, all the universities pulled together a whole lot of case studies for the last engagement and impact 2018 process. And so clearly there's potentially a marketing opportunity, so they're now being made available in various ways on the websites of different universities. So why we're all here today is where do libraries come into this whole conversation. I argue that the impact and open agendas have to be interlinked, because if we're talking about impact happening outside the academy, people outside the academy cannot engage with research if they can't read it. So the open agenda has to be linked into the impact agenda. But then there's also that secondary issue about making an unintelligible research project openly accessible is not necessarily making the research available. There still needs to be a translational aspect to it about explaining what this research is and why it matters. From a sort of technical point of view, there are some clear markers to where libraries can be involved in this whole program. So last time, the engagement and impact process, it marked the case studies on 2 aspects. One was the impact of the research itself, and the second thing was the approach to impact. So how did the university support the impact side of things? Now, what I've done is I've gone through the process, the report that's come out of the engagement and impact process last year. I had a look, and what they did was they broke down the really successful high case studies, the case studies and the approaches to impact that achieved a high grading, and sort of talked about what was in them, what were the common themes that were in them. And if you break those down, that starts to give you pretty much a checklist, a rubric of what you're going to need to include if you want to get a high next time, if that makes sense. So let's just quickly look at this question about approach to impact. So the pilot report, because there was a pilot on this whole process that was done earlier, and then that was reported in 2017, which then sort of formatted put the sort of parameters around how the whole process would work in 2018. But what they're saying is the approach to impact is the actions that the institution and its faculties and schools and research groups assist in the realisation of impact. And so they said, can the case studies show what it is that the university or the institution has done to make the impact occur? So when I looked at this engagement and impact assessment report, they said there were 637 impact case studies that were put in altogether. And of those, 159 received a high rating. So that works out to be 25%. So 1 in 4 got a high rating. And then what they said was when they talked about approach to impact, the things that kept coming up as themes were support for ongoing collaboration, provision of infrastructure, and support mechanisms of knowledge transfer. So I then did an analysis, and I'll just show you some of those. So for example, under provision of infrastructure, they talk about technological support. And what I've done here is the bits that are in red are the bits that I think is where libraries step into the game. So one of them, of course, is providing publicly accessible digital research databases, for example. Well, that's just our bread and butter. It's what we do in libraries. Another one is web pages and other sophisticated online tools enabled research engagement with and recruitment of the public to participate in research projects. A lot of libraries are doing this sort of work already. Virtual technologies are important for communicating and enhancing understanding of research. So these are all areas where I think libraries can be involved, or probably already are. Also under the idea about provision of infrastructure was building and workplace infrastructure, and clearly a specialist library is highlighted there. That's a very, very obvious one if you're in an institution that has a specialist library that can support research. And a third area of provision of infrastructure was administrative support. And they talk here about administrative support for travel and accommodation, but also support for research dissemination activities such as publishing. Now, a lot of our libraries already do that. Clearly, we make research openly accessible in our repositories. Some institutions have an article processing charges fund, so we support open access dissemination of research. We support publishing in lots of different ways in relation to hosting things like the open journal system, so it might be hosting academic-led publications that are coming out of the academy itself. So there's lots of different ways that I think that libraries are already doing this. A second area, of course, was support mechanisms for knowledge transfer. And they talked about training and mentorship of students and staff, particularly early career researchers. Well, libraries do a lot of work with early career researchers. They do work with HTR students and early career researchers in terms of training. And then training programs developed in collaboration with industry and other external partners, including skills development, network building and knowledge exchange. Again, this is bread and butter for our library communities. So there are clear synergies and areas where libraries are already working within this agenda. They may not necessarily be recognised by whoever it is that's looking after the impact agenda, and if nobody is looking after the impact agenda in an institution, it's probably a good idea for libraries to think about taking on that mantle. Here's another area of support mechanisms for knowledge transfer, which was social media. And so lots of social media platforms target disparate stakeholder groups and facilitate public participation, provide forums for the exchange of ideas, social media platforms, campaigns to increase the reach or application of research outcomes. So these are all the things that were listed in that report about the sorts of things that got high marks. So, as I've said before, open access is an essential first step. So I'm using Griffith examples here, but here's the Griffith repository. We all have them. So we are all trying to make our research openly accessible. But we also need translation. So this is an article I wrote a million years ago now. I think it was 2011. Can't even see. Yeah, a long time ago. About the need for researchers to talk about their research in understandable ways. Not all researchers can do that. Sometimes they need somebody to give them a bit of a hand. So here's something that's been going on at Griffith Library. The Griffith Library blog has blogs about all sorts of things, but one of the things that it talks about is taking advantage of events that are occurring anyway out there in the big wide world. So the one on the left is St. Patrick's Day. The one on the right is National Bird Day, as just two examples. And what the blog will do is sort of talk about the day, give a bit of description about what it's about. If it's malaria, for example, about problems with the malaria, the extent of the issue, and then point to a whole heap of research that's in the repository that's looking at that particular topic. And looking at the social media hits and the downloading hits in the repository, these campaigns, if you want to call them that, are very successful in increasing traffic to the articles in the repository. So that's a way of raising awareness and raising the sort of translation of research so that people can see it and understand a bit about why it matters and where it fits in. So I'm using terms like synergies. I think the current buzzword is partnerships, not synergies, but nonetheless, whichever word it is that's being used in your institution at the moment, there are clear ones with different areas of the university, in my eyes, in this area of impact. I think the library is really important. I think the marketing communications office is very important and the research office is very important. And the three of those administrative units need to work directly with our research community to sort of realise this impact agenda. So something that's happening at Griffith, for example, and I'm sure is happening everywhere else, is there's a process of monitoring media. There's a company called Media Monitors. It may be the one that your university uses. There's lots of others. But basically, it's sort of where and how the research and researchers of an institution appearing in media. So it might be asked to speak about the research that they've done. They might be asked to speak as an expert on commentary on something else that's occurring, and so on. So this is just a screen grab of one of the reports that comes out each week of the stuff that happens at Griffith, for example. This is useful because it's not impact in itself, but what it can do is identify hotspots. So what you can see is, oh, there's a lot of interest, like this particular person or this particular research area is being asked to do work or talk a lot about their work. What does that mean? Is that something we might want to follow up to sort of see if there might be a potential case study there? There's also things to do with publication analyses. And so this might be something that the research office does, or in fact, something that might be done by somebody who does bibliometric analysis in the library. Tanya is in on this meeting today, and she's that person in the library at QUT. So doing publication analyses and seeing if there's interest within the academy, which of course is not what we're talking about with impact, but if there is interest in the academy, a lot of activity around a particular area of research, that there might be an identification again of a hotspot that is worth investigating about whether or not there's an impact story to be had there. And then there's also university strategy. So the Griffith University strategy, which currently is running 2017 to 2020, is being updated. The Vice-Chancellor is currently working on it, I understand, and it's going to be coming out in late 2019. And I'm thinking it would be sensible for Griffith to get together between the person who's looking after impact, which is me at the moment in the research office, plus the people in the library, plus the marketing communications people, to sit down once the strategy has been released and look at it and talk collectively about how do we work together to make sure the messaging of the university and the case studies and the kind of language that we're using around this fit to the strategy of the institution, and so make sure that things are kind of on message, because otherwise we're all potentially working in completely isolation and working against one another. One of the things I think is very, very important for us in relation to having the libraries heavily involved in the impact agenda is a cultural one. I'm currently working as a consultant, and so I'm working sometimes for libraries and sometimes for the research office, and in the past I've worked for research offices before and also for libraries. There is a huge cultural difference between people working in libraries and people working in the research office, and the difference is that libraries are very collegiate. It's non-competitive. We work on problems like scholarly communication where we don't know the answers to everything. We do it collectively. We do it in a way that is open and is supportive of one another. And so it's quite okay on a discussion list to say, I'm stuck, I don't know how to approach this question, and other library staff will come back and say, yeah, we had the same problem, this is how we solved it. It's very different when you're talking about research office, because the nature of the work in a research office is it's often competitive, because they're looking at research grants. You've got research officers across the country who are working with the research community to compete with one another for the same small pot of money. So there is not necessarily that collegiate sense, and that's perfectly understandable. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different culture. Similarly, marketing and communications, coming often from actually a marketing and communications background, not from a university background. The media is extremely competitive by nature, so there's not necessarily that collegiate process. So I think having the library involved has got a double benefit. One, within the institution, of being able to work across different areas of the university, pulling them together and demonstrating that the silos need to be broken down, that we will work better together collectively rather than individually. But across the country, given what I was talking about earlier, that we don't have a set rubric, we don't really know what we mean by impact, we don't really know what it is we're measuring. This is a really good opportunity to work together to develop something that's meaningful and valuable, and rather than another tick box exercise. And the way we're going to do that is we need to do that as a bunch of institutions together, not do that in isolation and in a way that is sort of rejecting alternate views or discussions. So the only groups within the universities who are going to do it that way are libraries. So I do think that that's a really important cultural need for us to be involved as libraries. So what I've done, I'm going to make these slides available. These are some of the resources. There's many, but I just thought these are some things that I've just mentioned. Something that's interesting is the first one, which is free online impact training for researchers. I've signed up. I'm going to do this 5-week course by this group called Fast Track Fast Track Impact. So that could be worth, if you're interested in this impact stuff, could be worth sort of signing up for and doing it. It's supposed to take like 10 to 20 minutes once a week for 5 weeks. That's what they sell. That's how they sell it. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But so that was a sort of opening kind of overview I thought I'd give, so that we could open up the discussion to talk about anything you want to talk about.
Fabulous. Thank you, Danny. Does anyone have any questions for Danny? We're stunned with silence, I think.
Sorry, can you hear us on the other end?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
It's Jackie here from Southern Cross Uni. Hi, Danny.
Hi.
Just one thing to follow up on. Have you heard of ARMS, the
Yes.
Australian Benefit Society? So just to pick up on your point about how research officers don't tend to collaborate between universities, there is good collaboration there in terms of like interpreting the specifications within the ERA documents and things like that. So, and there is a bit of knowledge sharing about various topics. I've just finished ARMS accreditation course. But I wondered, I can at the same time see that they're still competing, like you say, for small pots of money. Could you please comment on that?
Can you just repeat the last bit? So you're quite echoey. Sorry, just that last bit.
So your comment about the different universities are still competing for the same money. I can see what you're saying there about the competition, but yeah, I just wondered if you could comment a bit further on that.
Okay, so what I'm talking about is the culture within the work environment. So within libraries, as I've just mentioned, as we all know, we work collaboratively in a sort of across sector way. Research officers don't necessarily do that per se. It's not culturally the way they operate. So if the research office has the ownership of the impact agenda, and if you've got somebody who has that ownership who doesn't operate in this collaborative way, then that's going to stymie the conversation. I understand what you're saying about ARMS, that there is special interest group for impact, which is great. And one of my colleagues at Griffith just spoke to me, who's just doing a similar accreditation, the one that sounds like you've just finished. And she was sort of talking to me about some of the discussions around impact that they're doing there, and that's really good. So I think we should foster that. But what I'm talking about is that grant applications are incredibly competitive, even at the best of times. So only it's like 21% or something of grants are successful. It's a very small number, and all institutions are applying for the same pool of money. So grant applications are competitive within the institution against other institutions, if that makes sense. So it's not. If I'm I'm in charge of the grant application process in one institution, I'm not necessarily going to be having conversations with my equivalent at another institution about some of the sort of technical or workflow processes that I'm occurring, or the strategic or conceptual processes that challenges I'm experiencing, because we want to keep the competitive advantage within our own institution. It's just a cultural thing, and it will depend on the person. I mean, certainly the people I worked at a million years ago at ANU on at the research office were quite open to these discussions, but I've worked with other people in research offices who were not.
One of the things, Danny, I also found interesting when talking to you is the realisation that not all research has impact. So we keep talking about impact, but we also have to realise that it doesn't apply to all the research that happens.
Yeah, so I think the conversation that we had was that was in the context of when I used to teach these PhD students about how to write about their work in understandable ways. And so we do the who, what, why, when, how. And we would say with the who cares statement. And you want to start with the who cares statement, a bit of, Australia is set to have more protein-filled milk due to some new research happening at blah, 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 something like that. Some areas of research, particularly PhD level, is research for research's sake. So it might be that you're developing a particular molecule, for example, that somebody else will be using in their research. And so we've got some research is quite hard to see where the end of it's going to be. Chemists in particular had trouble with this, but there was an interesting study that was done, and I tracked it down. It's called TRACES, and that TRACES stands for technology. I can't remember, it's an acronym, and it was done a long time ago. It was done sort of in the 60s, and what they did was, it can't have been that longer. What they did was they took 5 technologies, one of which was the VHS, another one was the contraceptive pill, and 3 others. And they said, okay, let's look at this technology, which has been an incredibly impactful on society technology, and let's trace back the research that went into it. And in some cases, the research went right back 100 years. So research that's happening now may well have impact into the future, but it may not be obvious for some time. That may not realise for some time. So the impact agenda is it's a 5-year period retrospectively, so there is some time allowed for things to occur. But it might be actually that the impact of the research that's happening today is not going to be seen for 20 years, 30 years, you just don't know. So yes, it's definitely, just because you're doing research doesn't mean it's going to have impact, and it may not have impact in this context in terms of outside the academy, in the context of improving society, health and wellbeing, or whatever kind of rubric we're using for that.
I've got that acronym for you too. It's technology on retrospect and critical evidence in science.
Oh, sorry, I'm just going to...
Your meeting's coming up.
No, I'm getting this a message. So anyway, any other questions?
Any other questions?
I just wanted to ask, thank you for the presentation, Danny. That was great. And impact is new to us all, and we don't have a really clear way of how to collect it as yet. And I guess at QUT, we haven't subscribed to any database or any particular way to do it. We are just making do with our systems that we have and just fitting impact collection in there. Do you have any insights into, I guess, different ways to collect it, or any recommendations?
Well, one of the things I'm going to be doing at Griffith, it's still in procurement process, so I haven't sort of done anything with it yet, is a product called Impact Tracker. So that's a product. There was a poll done of the people who were doing the ARMS accreditation module on impact, and they asked which system they were using. A large percentage. It was over a third. Some were using in-house systems and some were saying other, whatever that means, I'm not sure. But there are some tools. Impact Tracker's one. Symplectic has apparently the capability. I'm not quite sure how. I know you can gather professional activities in Symplectic, so that's one option, obviously, for things like past media or getting awards or those sorts of things can be collected in Symplectic Elements. My understanding is Pure has a capability as well. I don't know anything about it, but it was one of the options offered in that poll. Impact Tracker, the thing I'm going to be involved in, it has 8 sort of subsets. So one of them's financial and one's policy, and there's various other ones. And then 300 items under that, which might be improvement to workplace practice or etc. etc. So there's a whole set of them. Until I start using it, I'm not sure how usable this is going to be, let alone kind of reports we're going to be able to get out of it. But the way I'm approaching it is I'm looking at the current case studies that went into the Griffith case studies that went in last time, and I'm pulling out the claims of impact and then sort of classifying them. So it might be that this work involved change the policy in relation to how public transport is being promoted and how it's being used in a particular area, for example. So it might be change of policy, it might change workplace practice, it might be that then there's some numbers that are associated with the numbers of people using that public transport before and after this intervention, those sorts of things. So the kinds of things that are, numbers are helpful. If you can quantify things. So just saying it had an impact is not enough. It's sort of like, well, what was it that happened as a result of this? So quantifying things is helpful, being able to show that a policy has changed or workplace practice has changed, or that and just thinking some things are really hard to quantify. So how do you demonstrate that the research that you've done with a website that people are engaging with in terms of trying to deal with depression, for example, you might be able to say, yes, we had 50,000 hits on the website in however many years. But how do you demonstrate that you stopped X number of people from contemplating suicide? Yeah. Really hard.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thanks, Dan.